Welcome to the ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. A reminder before we start. We are recording our presentations and the following discussions, and we are posting these for our wider audience. The videos will be available on our YouTube channel, ICSS Marxist, and our website, icssmarx.org, in the next couple of days. We have also started sharing our videos on Rumble for a backup, and I'll post the links later in our chat today. Please visit our website, icssmarx.org, to view the past programs, sign up to receive weekly notification emails for upcoming programs, schedules, or to contact us and donate to run this educational forum. I would also like to thank those who have and still continue to support us through their valuable donations. My name is Mehmet Bayram, and I will be hosting this session on Sunday, May 18th, 2025. For over 15 years, ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum programs have been platform diverse presentations on various topics. This meeting is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. The opinions expressed here are those of the participants, and they do not necessarily represent those of ICSS. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our understanding is taken from Karl Marx's 11th thesis on Cuba. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Our guest today, Anthony D'Agostino, is a diplomatic historian, emeritus of San Francisco State University, and has written 5 books, along with many articles and reviews over the years, on the history of international politics, with attention to the Russian Revolution, Soviet politics, the Gorbachev period, and the fall of the Soviet Bloc. The last book was The Rise of Global Powers, International Politics in the Era of the World Wars, Cambridge University Press, 2012. Anthony is currently finishing up a history book on the Era of Globalization, 1968 to 2025. He also has a YouTube interview show called Glasnost in Our Time. So welcome, Anthony, and the mic is yours.
Thanks very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to talk to this group. I hope I will be able to say a few things that will interest you in some way. I hope there will be comments and questions about some of the things that I have to say about economic nationalism. And of course, it's a great pleasure for me to engage in this discussion with all of you. So the topic at hand is economic nationalism. So you see this discussed now almost as much as globalism. Globalization would have been discussed in 1990, 1992, 1995 or so. That is to say, it's starting to take on a certain, how to put it, ideological prominence in the public mind, certain, even you could call it zeitgeist, and ideology that is beginning to take hold officially. And you'll see people mentioning economic nationalism from now on, maybe with the same kind of enthusiasm that they have been mentioning globalism and globalization up until now. A terminological stardom, I would call this. And so we're seeing a transition ideologically speaking. Trump himself calls himself an economic nationalist. He said this many times. That is my ideology, so to speak, an economic nationalist. And he opposes that to globalism. So globalism has proclaimed for the last half century, or at least the last 30 years or so, that it represents all logic, all sensible, scientific, economic reasoning. It has dictated an ideology of neoliberalism. If Milton Friedman is in, Keynes is out. The New Deal is old hat. The world is flat. The global market rules everything according to the law of comparative advantage. And they even pull Karl Marx into the discussion. And they quote the many places where Karl Marx talks in almost gushing terms about the vitality and revolutionary character of capitalism, how it is breaking down all of the Chinese walls all around the world. Okay, but no longer. This era now looks like it is over, and now we are starting to hear that globalism is kaput. And so we have to ask then, what does the Trump revolution mean in terms of this discussion? He gave us an indication on the 2nd of April, 2025, when he declared what amounts to me as a declaratory general embargo. That is his trade policy, more or less. Start out with the declaration of a general embargo and then follow that up with negotiated bilateral trade agreements so that everybody is talking on a bilateral basis to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is setting all of the terms. The art of the deal. You can see the economic doctrine laid out by Steve Miran and Peter Navarro. They are the theorists of this. I don't know if it is a new ideology, one can call it that, but they are the theorists. And a splendid film, Death by China, done by Peter Navarro on YouTube, that tells you the whole story and presents it very, very eloquently, how the Chinese are, in effect, imposing themselves on globalization and in effect, becoming the, how to put it, the winners of the globalization. It makes a certain amount of sense as far as it goes. In fact, it makes a lot of sense as far as it goes. It's more or less the point of view of the trade unions in the United States for many, many years. Pat Buchanan has laid out this doctrine in some detail, and it is a kind of paleo-conservative view of things, and Trump has more or less followed them in that respect. And it has a certain ring to it. But strictly speaking, what is the theory? Is there an economic theory of globalism? I say there is none. There is none. And that economic nationalism, in effect, is the end of international economic theory. It's the end of it. From now on, it's a political perspective that will more or less determine economics. And I would argue that this is the general rule in history, that if they want to talk about the alternates in history, the way it's been presented by the globalist ideology in the last 30 to 50 years or so, the way it's been presented is that there used to be a mercantilist way of looking at things, and then the more globalist way, free trade, laissez-faire, all the rest of that, British political economy of the 1820s, basically. That took over. That's the alternates that we see in action in world history. It comes and it goes. If you look at a book like Jeffrey Frieden's book, The Rise and Fall of Capitalism, that's just the way he puts it. He says that that capitalism rose up and then it fell in World War I, and it stumbled and it rose up again, and it rose up mightily, and now it looks like it might be stumbling again. So there's a kind of a roller coaster ride that he's describing through history, and an alternance between what you might call the free trade perspective and the protectionist perspective, which underlies the rest of the alternates in ideology. So they like to put it, though, that free trade is the main track from which mercantilism is a deviation. So that's the alternate. So I would put it the other way around. Mercantilism is the main track in world history, and free trade is an interlude. Ideology of globalism has been hiding all of this stuff from us, and it has dictated its own kind of potted economic history, and it's been saying that history is the history of neoliberal capitalism. So I think we need a historian's critique of this, some historical notes about this. And I know there isn't time today to go into all the details about all of these issues, but perhaps I can say a few things. I won't be engaging in any real, how to put it, granular discussion of economics or even of politics. And I won't be taking on the thought of people like Robert Brenner or Giovanni Arrighi or Radhika Desai. And I won't be saying much about the innards of business or economic history, but I do want to make a few historical notes about the whole perspective of world politics that results from all of this discussion, and about perhaps even to talk more generally about that in terms of the zeitgeist, the whole spirit of the sense of where the world's going that takes root in the mind, what you might call the world mind, the ideological, how to put it, the ideological centerpiece of the world. I want to make a couple of observations about that, and I'll put them in the form of three theses. Thesis number one, the globalist ideology, therefore. Thesis number one, globalism says that there was a preview of globalism in the 19th century, that the British pound and the gold standard represent a preview. And you can call it anglobalization. That's the colorful phrase used by Neil Ferguson in a book that did a big sales and has got talked about a lot. And I think on the whole is generally accepted by a lot of prestigious authorities. And globalization, so that the English pound and the gold standard in the 19th century, they're a preview of the globalism, a phenomenon that we've seen in the last half century. That's thesis number one. I want to argue against that. Okay, thesis number two. The Russian Revolution in 1917, from 1917 to 1991, was a bad dream. It's just some kind of a strange interlude that we can't explain yet, maybe someday, but it does not take part really in any kind of discussion of history. In fact, we have to forget all of the history associated with the Russian Revolution. And you have to say even that the Russians themselves endorsed this idea. They hardly have any way of integrating their idea of the Russian Revolution into their current ideological outlook. It just represents a strange deviation, maybe a sin, a bizarre idea. So that's a fundamental notion. I want to argue against that. And it's the main factor, the Russian Revolution, the main factor of 20th century modern history. In fact, the overthrow of socialism in the Soviet Bloc is the essential premise of globalization. And the argument that comes from that, that the USSR fell for economic reasons, is part of the whole ideological underpinning of the socialist idea, and in my opinion, the essential part. So I think that's all wet. The overthrow of communism in Russia was a political fiasco with revolutionary results. That's my formula for it. I've written on this at some length, a very detailed book that appeared in 1998 called Gorbachev's Revolution, which has a very, very granular discussion, day-to-day almost discussion of Glasnost and Perestroika, and the whole process of ideological degeneration that resulted in the overthrow of the Soviet power in 1991. And if I had to sum all of that up, I would say it is not a kind of a logical phenomenon or even a necessary phenomenon in economic history at any rate, but more of a political fiasco with revolutionary results. I'll talk more about that as we go on. Number three, China is capitalist and will have a Gorbachev revolution one of these days. That has been a fundamental assumption that underlines the tolerance of Chinese communism in the globalist system over the last 30 to 50 years. I think this is wrong too. China is not going capitalist. China is really, strictly speaking, a dictatorship of the proletariat. And it looks like the centerpiece of 21st century world history. Not to say that it represents a new world order in itself, but the questions posed by the Chinese Revolution and by the antagonism with the rest of the world, they comprise the main struggle in world politics today. So those are the three theses. Globalism has a preview in the 19th century. The Russian Revolution is a bad dream. China is going the way of globalism. Those are three arguments. And let me just say a little bit more about those three arguments, and then I'll open it up, or you'll open it up for questions and comments. And I hope I managed to say something about these three propositions that you haven't heard before. At least I'm shooting for that. First, globalism is a revival of the political economy of the 1820s and of Ricardian comparative advantage. Mercantilism is old hat. Not so. Mercantilism is not old hat, was never old hat. Already in the 1840s, you have Friedrich List laying out a whole elegant theory of economic nationalism with a whole historical perspective behind it, and an outstanding historical example, Alexander Hamilton and the United States, the infant industries argument. So there's economic nationalism right away. In fact, you could argue that the main rule is that in regard to mercantilism, states grow rich by use of mercantilism. And they adopt free trade at the top once they have achieved a certain kind of hegemony. You can't get rich, as List laid out elegantly. You can't get rich by free trade. You can't get to the top by playing fair. I want to talk about how China represents a kind of a qualification of that argument, but that is the general argument in mercantilism. Zhang Hajun has laid it out fairly well. Kicking Away the Ladder and some other books of his, which he talks about essentially Listian politics. And the Chinese study this stuff and have mentioned Friedrich List a lot in their publications. So they know all about this. Strictly speaking, free trade is an interlude. Starts with the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 and runs up to the German protective tariff of 1898. And after the German protective tariff, the real zeitgeist in the world economy, if you want to think of it that way, the real zeitgeist in the world economy was mercantilism. Everybody imitated the Germans, not the British, from that point, and right up until World War I. So from 1878 right up to the beginning of World War I. And moreover, they all adopted the gold standard. So that is entirely anomalous in terms of the way globalism and Neil Ferguson and the others set this thing up. That is entirely anomalous. The gold standard goes with mercantilism. Okay, so these are mainly French ideas that we're talking about, or at any rate, the way the British write our history. I think British historians have had the biggest influence on writing, in general, all of European history for Americans. So we see the world pretty much through their lens. Often it's very good, not to quarrel with it that much, but it is a British perspective. So when they talk about mercantilism, it's mainly French ideas. It's Colbertism, strictly speaking. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the economic minister who worked for Louis XIV back in the 17th century, laid out this whole perspective of economic policy having to do with canal building, public works of all sorts, import quotas, tariffs, protectionism, etc. Colbertism would be a way of describing economic nationalism well into the 19th century and maybe even beyond that. These are French ideas. Napoleon's continental system recalls that, an attempt to wall off all of the continent, all the territories that Napoleon had conquered militarily, wall it all off with tariffs and shut it all off to the British. And that is the perspective of the French, the way the British have to see it. But the other perspective is not right. The Bank of England did not call all the shots in the 19th century. There was also, in addition to economic nationalism, there was the heritage of the Atlantic revolutions, the French Revolution, Bonapartism, the Haitian the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution. The heritage of these revolutions persists into the 19th century and even into the 20th century, and provides an important energy behind the thinking of the Russian Revolution. Looking at this in a grand intellectual history perspective. And Bonapartism shows up in the 19th century very prominently in the Latin American dictatorships, which look to Bonaparte. And you can see Bonapartism all over, and you can see it today, and you can see it in Africa. Traore and the Burkina Faso dictatorships in the Sahel, these are Bonapartist, and that's what they present, in effect. Bonapartism was a big deal in the 19th century. The British would like us not to even remember that it existed, but it wasn't just Napoleon the First, it was Napoleon the Third. It's the Second Empire. It's the period 1851 to 1871, when, in effect, that was the kind of almost the intellectual centerpiece of European development, quite a bit like the New Deal, strictly speaking. A Bonapartism that tries to meet all things to all people, that engages in big public works, that makes the trade unions happy, and even treats them reasonably well, rather like the New Deal, in effect, that kind of Bonapartism. All of it upset by, you might even call it an imitation of Bonapartism, Bismarck's wars of national liberation. I don't ever see German historians describe them that way, but one could. The three wars that unified the German Empire, led by the Prussians, of course, that the rise of that tendency at the same time as the rise of a national revolutionary formation in the United States led by Abraham Lincoln, those are the things that destroyed Bonapartism. Otherwise, Bonapartism might have been much more important in the 19th century. Disraeli's imperialism, which historians like to call the new imperialism. And that involves the scramble for Africa, the scramble for concessions on the China coast, and in effect, the scramble for the world. I called it that in this book on the rise of the great powers. In fact, I wanted to use that for the title, but they talked me out of it. They said, the rise of the great powers will make it like Paul Kennedy's book, the rise of the rise of global powers. They said, we'll make it like Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise of Great Powers. And that lit my eyes up. A big mistake on my part. I should have stuck to the original title, which would have been Scramble for the World. But at any rate, that scramble for the world unleashed by Disraeli in the 1870s, that's as a result of the defeat of France. So the French fall on their faces. Bismarck destroys France, and the British grab hold of the Suez Canal. That's what begins it all. So those are the tendencies. And we're not even talking about the pound or the gold standard or things of that sort. I'm talking about general economic trends and all the rest of it. We're talking about struggle for power and the revolutionary tendencies unleashed by the French Revolution. So Marx and Engels, they hated Bonapartism. They thought Bonaparte was a charlatan and a fool and a wicked character. They were against the Risorgimento. They did not want to see Italy united. That is pretty much a project of Bonapartism, a project of Napoleon III. Marx and Engels were against that. They supported Prussia pretty much. They worried about Prussia and its national interests. They worried about Austria. They were opponents of France. They said Bismarck, in uniting Germany, was pretty much doing our work for us. That's the way Marx put it to Engels, doing our work for us. So they're pretty much with Germany. The success of the German wars, they even said, shows that our idea is superior to Proudhon's. Interesting. That's an interesting thought. They saw Germany as the country of the future. It would probably be socialist. Socialism and mercantilism would probably be the rule in Germany. I don't think they had a particular doctrine about mercantilism or free trade or any of that. And they saw that this socialism that was going to develop in Germany would probably be opposed to the Anglo-Saxons, but it was necessary to make how to put it, a civilized bargain with them, and to move together with them. Marx and Engels would have been in line with the Salisbury tradition in German politics. Salisbury tradition, I mean, in British politics. Salisbury tradition says that we have to be on good terms with the biggest powers and come to terms with them, rather than employing the balance of power, trying to balance them automatically. Balance of power is a last resort. And what would you say? Appeasement is the first perspective. Marx and Engels, their thinking would have been in harmony at any rate with that sort of idea. German socialists, the socialists of the chair, they were called, Gustav Schmoller, Adolf Wagner, all big university figures call themselves socialists. They laid this argument out pretty much. Germany was a country of the future. It was going to be mercantilist and progressive. It represented what I would call a modernizing old regime. And I would argue that in the 19th century, not Anglobalization, not liberalism, not a liberal world order under the pound or even the gold standard was the rule. It was the idea of a modernizing old regime in which you have an absolute monarchy, you have nobility that run everything. The nobility they lead the armed forces and they lead the bureaucracy. The bourgeoisie is confined to business and the economy generally, but takes no part at all in politics. The trade unions, we don't know. The trade unions have to be appealed to as nationalists, and in the end, maybe they have to be suppressed by police. I mean, the Russians tried an experiment with police unionism in 1897. So that's the model of a modernizing old regime. I would argue that not British liberalism and constitutionalism, the Whig way of looking at this, that wasn't the zeitgeist, the thrilling idea at the turn of the century, but this idea of a modernizing old regime. It combined mercantilism with a gold standard. So there it is. That is the opposite of what has been put forward by the globalist perspective on the 19th century. Okay, so it follows that this might have been, how to put it, might have been very powerful had there not been World War I. And looking at it in terms of economy, it's impossible. And I've seen people try to do it, very unsuccessful. They try to make an argument for an economic causes of World War I. Of course, you resort to imperialism. You talk about the imperial scramble, but that's more than economics. No economic argument, in my opinion, no strictly economic argument for World War I. It was a balance of power war, the British using the Franco-Russian alliance against the German naval threat, essentially. So, according to Marxism, this is entirely irrational. This makes no sense at all. The prevailing Marxism at the time, if you consider the Pope of Marxism during that period, and that even means for the Russian Bolsheviks, Karl Kautsky, for him, this is the most irrational thing in the world. And you can certainly understand his thinking that. Even during World War I, Kautsky kind of prefigured globalism. He said that would be the right way, not world war. We have to get off this track of fighting to the end. Europeans might think that way today. Get off this track of fighting to the end against Russia. And that was the perspective of Karl Kautsky. He was really a globalist before his time. Ultra-imperialism of Karl Karl Kautsky. World War I was entirely irrational according to Marxist ideas of the period. And it's not much different from Norman Angel's famous book, The Great Illusion, which said there probably wouldn't be any World War I because it was so irrational, made no sense at all. It destroyed 4 empires. Quite irrational. So, British globalism under the pound in gold, that was an English aspiration, a hope, a daydream in the final analysis. By no means a preview of a world order such as we have been contending with over the last 30 to 50 years. That's thesis number 1. Thesis number 2, globalism says the Russian Revolution was a bad dream. Not so. It's the essential part of the 20th century. Putin, Alexander Dugin, and gentlemen like that are wrong to treat the Soviet experience like a bad dream. They have to come to terms with it. They have to see the continuity of their state with it. It's vital for the success, for the survival, in my opinion, of their state. They make it out that it's just a thing that we can't properly explain. And in effect, they are arguing that it's a bad dream. Yet on May 9th every year, they celebrate World War II. And out come the red flags and all of the visual appurtenances of the communist regime. And that's the thing they're celebrating. This is an enormous contradiction in the mind of modern Russia. They have to come to terms with the role of war in the past. You can see history imposing this on them as they continue to fight Ukraine now, year after year. They are re-Sovietizing, in effect, renationalizing property in Russia. The effects of war are bringing back, in my opinion, the idea of communism, or at any rate, some kind of relation to the heritage of that earlier period. Communism has succeeded in war, came to power fighting war in 1917, but all its great victories come as a result of mobilization for war, mobilization of the dictatorship of the proletariat for war, you could say. The Gorbachev revolution, then, is that an accident? The globalists who benefited from the thing, who were delighted at the results, they get to interpret it. That's sort of a rule. When history decrees that when a big thing happens, the winners get to describe the reasons for it to the losers, and the losers haven't got much of an argument. At any rate, they haven't got history on their side anymore. But the globalists saying that it was an economic failure, this is not right. This is not right. Putin himself says that there was a time bomb put in place by Lenin. That's not exactly right. I mean, it certainly describes the form of the breakup of the Soviet Union, but it does not describe the dynamics of the thing. You cannot blame Gorbachev on Lenin. I don't think so. The Chinese say that failure to preserve Article 6, that is the leading role of the party, failing to preserve Article 6, failing to preserve the state power, failing to understand the state power as the basis, based on the communist monopoly of power. That's the big economic failure. And I think that makes enough sense. I mean, it may be a little crude, but it makes enough sense to provoke the communists, to give them the basis, in my opinion, of resisting the idea that a Chinese Gorbachev would be a good idea. That idea was certainly available to them, and that is the globalist perspective for the Chinese. But on account of their analysis being, in my opinion, a little sharper, not much, but a little sharper than the Western analysis of the failure of the Soviet Union, That is, I think, the reason why we still have the Chinese resisting globalism today. Bolshevism still favored Germany, as they did in the 19th century until 1923. And the anti-imperial aspect of the rise of Germany, that would have been also the Soviet perspective had there been a German Revolution. Germany, remember, opposed British imperialism. They opposed it in World War I. They called for jihad in the Muslim countries against the British Empire. They landed Roger Casement in Ireland in 1916 to start the Easter Rebellion. They sent Lenin to Russia. So they were anti-imperialist and, in a certain sense, revolutionary during World War I. Bolshevism, unlike the Marxism of the 19th century, came to fight for India and China. And when Bolshevism finally succeeded in defending itself in World War II, the revolution that World War II represented, in effect, represented the liberation of India and China. Nazism's last chance to destroy the Russian Revolution, or I should say, Nazism was the last chance to destroy the Russian Revolution. And the British appeasers, they understood this. And you even see this presented in British historiography. A lot of British historians in the 1980s came back and took a second look at appeasement and World War II, the Churchill tradition, and all the rest of that. And these are conservative-minded people, most of them. John Charmley, David Irving, D.C. Watt, A.J.P. Taylor's book on the origins of World War II regretted the failure of appeasement. And why do they regret it? Well, the British Empire was lost. And as a result of fighting in World War II and destroying Nazism, they gave the world over, so they thought, to the Yankees and the Bolsheviks. So that was their perspective on the thing in that discussion. But the appeasers were foiled by FDR, who told them that the U.S. would not be a backstop to the British if appeasement failed. And so that's why the British abandoned appeasement in 1939. So the third thesis, globalism and communism globalism says that communism has failed and that China has decided for capitalism in 1978 and would soon have all of the other appurtenances of capitalism, would soon be a liberal democracy. That's say there'd be a Chinese Gorbachev. It doesn't look that way since Xi Jinping came to power. China has revived the Maoist tradition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Bo Xilai and the Chongqing Wei, they have won. They've been defeated politically, but their ideas have in effect been absorbed by the rest of the party. And there's been a revival of Maoism, a defense of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the Chinese would say, a defense of the dictatorship of the proletariat against globalism. So globalism has failed there. Looked at more broadly, the dictatorship of the proletariat is a factor in the global economy, along with the rest of the heritage of the revolutions of Western civilization, including the Atlantic revolutions. Neoliberal history describes a world economy without the Soviet Union in the interwar period, and even in the Cold War. But the Soviet five-year plans, they didn't do badly in the struggle against Hitler. And the Soviet economies, or I should say the satellite, what we call the satellite economies, in the period of the Cold War, they didn't do too badly vis-a-vis the Western economies. China grew faster than India. There were considerable successes. If it were just a question of a statistical race between statist economies on the one side and the communist world, Comecon on that side, and capitalist economies, laissez-faire economies on the other side, if it were a statistical competition that could be decided by a panel of judges, they didn't do too badly, strictly speaking. They were certainly not outclassed by the outside world. But in a way, that whole argument is irrelevant because all of the advances in the communist bloc fed the desire to westernize. So they all hurt communism. The better communism performed, the less people liked communism. And the reason for that, I guess, is the anomalies of the historical conjuncture between East Europe and West Europe and the role of the intelligentsia and the fact that the intelligentsia throughout the whole period of the Gorbachev revolution and the echoes of it in the Eastern Bloc, the intelligentsia made a market choice. I'm not saying that it's generally a democratic market choice, but the intelligentsia brought along the rest of the democracy. So in effect, when we talk about the performance of the communist states, it's kind of irrelevant. The performance doesn't make people happier with the regime. But nevertheless, despite that, the dictatorship of the proletariat emerged as a power in the international balance. And this had been the case for the Soviets in the interwar period. And you could even say the split between the Soviets and the Chinese, it's a sign of gaining power by that bloc, competition to lead the most dynamic movement in world history, which is indicated by Bandung in 1955, the movement of the Third World. So there's dynamism to it. Khrushchev tried to connect himself one way or another. He thought of himself as a revolutionary, tried to connect himself one way or another with the Bandung movement. Tito was part of the Bandung movement. Khrushchev tried to appease Tito, tried to reconcile with Tito by means of giving a secret speech to the 20th Congress of the party in 1956 in order to join this Bandung bloc, in order to turn it into a peace bloc and to lead it in a world revolutionary struggle. So Khrushchev was a revolutionary in that way. In nuclear politics, he sought to keep the USA from giving nuclear weapons to Germany. And it's a kind of bargain that was worked out at that time. Adenauer was denied nuclear weapons by the United States, and Khrushchev denied nuclear weapons knowledge, 1958 and 59, denied them to the Chinese. This is the basis for the split. Not a quarrel over Stalin or Stalinism or the secret speech or broader ideological matters, but a matter between the two states, matter involving nuclear weapons. Imagine a matter of using nuclear weapons in a revolutionary way to oppose the West, which Khrushchev continued to try to do right up until the Cuban Missile Crisis. China acted like a great power. China hated détente. The Cultural Revolution in 1966 was directed against Russia, trying to remove party persons in high places who are taking the capitalist road and who are supporting Russia and who might even make common cause with the Russians in overthrowing Mao. Once the Vietnam War was won, and the signal for that for the Chinese was the Tet Offensive in 1968, China turned to the United States. China employed a balance of power calculus. Against Russia, the Chinese urged a struggle against the Russian communism. And they did this until the late Gorbachev period. They did this really right up until 1990, 1991 or so, and might even have gone over to Gorbachev, gone over to some kind of actual support for Gorbachev in 1990, 91. And they demonstrated that they opposed the Russians twice. In 1969, at Damansky-Jampo Island, where they actually fought the Russians to demonstrate how much they wanted to join with the West against the Russians. And again, when they attacked Vietnam in 1979, 10 years later. These were demonstrations, in effect, by the Chinese to the West that they were opponents of the Soviets, wanted to urge the West, urge the United States to fight the Soviets all the more. At the same time, though, as I've already indicated, they studied the revolution in Russia. They concluded that Gorbachev was not the way to go, that he had made terrible mistakes. And they did not go along with the view that the revolution had showed the superiority, or I should say the revolution against the Soviets had showed the superiority of the market economy. So these are the myths, I think, of the Soviet Bloc and the centerpiece of global ideology. In fact, I think it was possible, actually, at the turn of the century that China might go entirely for globalism, might fully restore capitalism, that is to say, might turn the banks over, might privatize all the banks, and make China a genuine capitalist system. And there was a debate about it. And the argument was made in this debate that Karl Marx would have supported this notion. There's a very considerable, articulate statement of Karl Marx as the supporter of the globalist alternative. And they lost that debate. Why is not clear. Might have had to do with the crisis in the Taiwan Strait in 1995, might have had to do with the crushing of Yugoslavia at the end of the 90s. We're not sure, but that decision was not made, and China resisted. Some made the argument, Kishore Mahbubani makes this argument, that globalism has turned out to be favorable to the Chinese. This is exactly the argument of Peter Navarro, by the way, and of all the people around Trump, that China has won the economic competition. So looking back on the whole thing, we have to say, what killed globalism? Maybe you could say the destruction of Yugoslavia. Remember that Yeltsin turned against globalism and the United States very sharply as a result of the crisis over Kosovo. And the rise of Putin occurs at about this same time. You can't say it's Putin because Yeltsin already is on that track. Second factor, the crash of 2008 and the Chinese resort to Keynesianism. Milton Friedman had been arguing for years that Keynesianism is old hat. The Chinese now demonstrated that a Keynesian program, public works, statist stimulation of the economy was the only way to recover from the crash. So in a way, that showed that the Chinese were never going to be recruited for neoliberalism and for globalism. And third, ruined by the rise of Xi Jinping. As you can see in a number of documents, document number 9 is the important one, I think, 2012, which warns about all of the activity going on in the Chinese economy that is sponsored by Western sources, Western influencers, and argues against this and really lays the case out for the defense of socialist dictatorship of the proletariat. So globalism now is seen as a vehicle of Chinese supremacy. I don't think this is supremacy, but that's the way it's being argued nowadays, which you can see as the biggest threat, or has been presented as the biggest threat to the U.S., to the USA. With regard to Trump, there is no Trumpian economic order. In fact, Trumpism is the alternative to an economic order, which never existed anyway. Trump's deflection or defection from the camp of Ukraine leaves the rump NATO, Germany, France, Britain, Poland, trying to organize Europe around the idea of opposing Russia, an idea which I don't think can possibly have legs. And there must be eventually some kind of turn from this notion, even if it's going to be led by right-wing parties. I don't think the populations can be mobilized against Russia. But even so, the rump NATO countries, England, France, Germany, Poland, they don't say they're going to rescue globalism. They accept the idea that globalism is kaput. So they're part of some post-globalist order, whatever it is. Trump got power by ending two wars, by promising to end two wars. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize. We might even wish him luck in this enterprise, but he has no special formula for reshaping the world economy. And in fact, maybe we've spent too much time, too much energy talking about how the world economy is going to run. And maybe that's not the question. Maybe the real question is, are we going to have World War III? Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Tony. That was very deep and great information. But to going forward, before we go on to the next part of the QA session, I'd like to remind everybody that we have another great session coming next Sunday, May the 25th, and titled "The Historic and Current Significance of Victory Day 2025." It's related to today's topic as well. We are going to have a group discussion on the lessons of the 1945 victory over Nazi Germany and the significance of the worldwide celebrations of Victory Day 2025. So please join us with your ideas, comments, and questions for what should be a lively and informative session that's coming up next week. Now, for our question and answers, I'd like to remind once again that to please respect the time of the speaker and other participants by limiting yourself to 2 minutes, and also to ask one question at a time so that the speaker will be able to respond to that question. So with that, I would like to then open up, if you would like to respond, if you'd like to have a question or a comment, please raise your hand, and I will go with the hands up and try to allow people to ask questions. As we usually do, only the people who have not spoken in the first round will have the priority, and those who want to ask another question will kind of go to the second round. So that's why we go. I think Kim Eng's iPad is the first one, and just a minute, I'd like to allow you to unmute yourself. Yes, please. Kim, go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks. I just kind of want to make two comments to put what the speaker said in context. One of them is the question of China invasion of Vietnam in 1979. I think you got to put in the context of the fact that Vietnam invaded Cambodia, and there was China was warning Vietnam, and when they didn't withdrew, China invaded Vietnam and then left as soon as Vietnam left Cambodia. I think that has got to be put in context. Otherwise, I saw questions on the chat that people were saying, why did China invade Cambodia, Vietnam? So that's one aspect. The second is that the thing about the criticism of Stalin and whatnot has been very troublesome to the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that at that time, Mao called it historical nihilism. And it's very clear that even in spite of the opening up, reform and opening up period, Deng Xiaoping made it very clear to the Western countries that no matter what happened in the Cultural Revolution, they will never treat Mao like Khrushchev treated Stalin. And as a result of that, you see Mao's portrait is up on Tiananmen Square, and his statues are never pulled down because they respect what Mao did, and the fact that he makes some mistakes because nobody knew how socialism, the zigs and zags to how you bring about socialism. There's no blueprint. So I just kind of want to make those comments to put it in context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Tony, if you want to respond to that.
We could take a few more.
Okay, if you want it that way, that's fine. Then Janet, I have Janet and then Raj in the queue. So go ahead, Janet, unmute yourself, please.
Thank you. So going back to basics, for those of us who don't have economic backgrounds, would you briefly define terms such as economic nationalism, globalism, free trade, mercantilism, Bonapartism, and how they relate to financialization and the ownership of the means of production? Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. I guess we can also have Raj ask his question, and then we'll let Tony respond. Go ahead, Raj. Please unmute yourself.
Tony, thanks for very interesting talk. Lots of things there, but let me. I've had considerable difference from your analysis, and you have very wide canvas in your talk. But I'm going to pick up on the crisis today that is bringing about economic nationalism, not just here, but economic nationalism is actually appearing in many places. And it seems to be, it is from the success of the Chinese model, whatever you want to call it. I don't consider it to be socialist. I consider it to be capitalism run by a communist party, so it's a kind of peculiar formation. But it is capitalism. Ultimately, it is for profit. And that is the definition of capitalism, that you do that. So my question is this economic nationalism, which you think is switches back between free market and this is kind of like a on-off switch, or this, I think this is because United States control as a great imperialist power has slipped, and they realize the mistake they have made by letting China, and you describe that, becoming a competitor, a peer competitor. That's where this tension is coming from. And so please comment any way you like on this, but that's my understanding of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Go ahead.
Okay, let's see. Kim says, refers to China and its attack on Vietnam, and she talks about the context of the whole thing. Rivalry between China and Russia, you could say, in Southeast Asia, which involved overthrow of the Cambodian government by the Vietnamese, and Chinese supporting the Cambodians, and the Soviets under Brezhnev supporting the Vietnamese. Yeah, that's the whole context of the thing. It's a fight between the Chinese and the Soviets for influence over the newly liberated, so to speak, Southeast Southeast Asia. And so, I'm not a question of blaming anybody. I'm not, in effect, trying to say that it was wrong for the Chinese to do whatever they did vis-a-vis Vietnam, except to indicate that in this general context, the Chinese wanted the United States to see them at that time, wanted the United States to see them as fighting against the Soviets and as loyal people struggling against the Soviets. And Deng, when he came to the United States in 1979, visited the Boeing factory and all the rest of that. And he repeatedly said that the United States wasn't fighting hard enough against the Russians. And so they were trying to set the example, trying to give an indication that they were on the team with the United States fighting against the Soviet, wanted to encourage. As a great power, I think, China wanted to encourage the antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union. Want to make that the centerpiece. And they wanted to make themselves kind of people who enjoyed a role, the third who enjoys, so to speak. And I argue that this was a demonstration. And it wasn't much of a war effort. They went in and out of Vietnam very quickly. The Vietnamese didn't even mobilize fully to oppose it. So I think everybody in the region understood that it was just a demonstration. Okay. And then the second point that Kim raises about the criticism of Stalin and Deng's remark to the effect that they would never do to Mao as Khrushchev did to Stalin in 1956. Well, could be. Duly noted on my part. So I have no objection to make or no really meaningful comment about that observation of Kim's, except to say that Khrushchev thought he was doing it for revolutionary reasons, to try to recruit Tito, try to get into the Bandung Bloc, try to form a connection between communist countries and the Bandung Bloc against the West. Janet says that I should define economic nationalism and globalism and free trade. I'm not so great at these precise, abstract definitions of things outside of a historical context. I only see them in history at a certain point. So that's the difficulty. But she also brings up the question of financialization, which I did not give much attention to. But those of you who have studied globalism, I think there are many people in this group who've studied globalism economically, will say that the essential drive in globalism is to center around financialization, to outsource industry, and to ruin Detroit and the Rust Belt states by the outsourcing of industry to seek cheap labor in the outside world, and even a broader conception where there's a world division of labor in which the United States plays the role of the financier. So you could say there's a general tendency in capitalism toward financialization, a rentier tendency. Marx talked about the monopoly tendency in capital. You could go the next step and say there's a tendency for them to escape their countries, in effect. And that's what Churchill was talking about at the turn of the century. He said, we want to take part in the profits of the rest of the world. And as a great power such as we are, we certainly should be able to do that. And that, I think, is a kind of a general tendency. We see it very, very strongly today. The rentier, you could call it the rentier tendency. So Janet is, I think, good to bring that up. Raj says that let's see, China is not socialist. Okay, we could argue into the night. Maybe Raj could convince me that I'm wrong about this. I would look at document number 9, though, and there are a couple of other documents that they issued. And I would say those are not documents saying that capitalism is the future for China. They're documents saying, watch out for globalism. We're going to be in trouble if neoliberalism really takes hold and the ideology of a Western liberal order takes hold among the Chinese intelligentsia. There are warnings, in effect. I see there the reflexes of a Maoist dictatorship of the proletariat. I don't know, though. It's a difficult question because China is highly capitalist. I mean, my son visiting there, I said, tell me something about that you saw that was socialist. He said, I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything in China that I would call socialist. Well, it's an argument we can continue to have. But I would say, though, that on the whole, the antagonism of the rise that the Chinese rise of China has caused, perhaps is part of this document number 9. If you read, say, Orville Schell on this, and he's a person who has a lot of purchase among important people in the United States, he kind of takes this very seriously, that neoliberalism and globalization, etc., the ideology has lost the race in China. He started to say this in about 2012. I think that was right on the button, because I think that's was the viewpoint of Xi Jinping. This is very much a matter in flux, and I would cite the new economic policy that Lenin put into place in 1921, which permitted a degree of capitalist economy in the Soviet Union. Soviet Russia at that time was going to be the Soviet Union, permitted capitalist economy, free trade in grain, freedom for the net men in the market towns, and the rest of that. And also a foreign policy of seeking trade credits and recognition from the Western powers in return for certain economic concessions. And that Lenin didn't think that this was the end of the dictatorship of the proletariat at that time. And frequently, since then, communist leaders have gone back, whenever they talk about market reforms and things of that sort, they reference Lenin's NEP. They say that Lenin only wanted to have state capitalism. That's indicated by a document he released in 1918. Lenin only wanted to have state capitalism in Russia, did not want to turn it into a fully socialist state, only wanted to imitate the German war economy. So this is a interesting discussion. It's dynamic. It has to be decided, I think, not on the basis of statistical material. I think it has to be decided on the basis of the actions, the dynamism of this state. How is it acting? I think that's the essential thing. Okay, and then lastly, Raj says the U.S. has slipped and thinks it's a mistake to have allowed China status as a peer. Yeah, I think he's right about that. And that is what you see in the writings of the people around Trump and in the things that Trump says.
Just if I may make a following comment, not to make a long debate, is the way I consider socialism versus capitalism is production for profit, which is what I see happening in China. State control is different, so there is a peculiarity to Chinese model. That's all.
Yeah, thank you. So now I'm going to go to Gene. Please, Gene, go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Well, Tony, this was a great talk. Thank you. And there's a whole lot that I still need to assimilate for. So there's a lot there. But I just want to throw out a somewhat different perspective, because my understanding of China is that it's not a nation, it is a civilization historically. It has been it's to be compared not with the petty states in Europe, but with European civilization. And the Chinese view it in these terms. They're the Middle Kingdom. They control the world. They're all the civilized world was encompassed by China, and they were a creative civilization that, not only gunpowder to the compass and a whole series of other things, but they sent this vast armada to Eastern Africa comprised like 100 ships, each of them the size of a football field, compared with Vasco da Gama and his little almost rowboats. So this is the perspective I have towards China, and I think this is reflected in world politics, whereas United States has 800 military bases all over the world. I think China has one, I think in Djibouti. And United States, extracts all it can from Africa and other countries and so on, whereas China has the Belt and Road Initiative, which is trying to build up these societies. So I look at these in different terms, and I think you can see that not only historically, but also in terms of contemporary world politics. And I look as China as a very positive force in contemporary world politics. But I'll just throw that out for you to comment on that if you care to.
Thank you.
Mehmet, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Go ahead, Tony, if you'd like to answer that, or would you like me to get...
Could we take a few more?
Sure. Let's do that. Richard is next. Richard Wright, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Pardon me, I got to stretch here a little bit. I just wanted to talk a little bit. You talked about economic nationalism. That was the topic at hand. And the thing that struck me, and that I think it was Janet, I think, asked you to define that. And what strikes me about that is a lot of people. To me, it struck me as being a conflation of political dynamics with economic dynamics. So what you have is the nationalism part is what I would think is the political dynamics. And that extends back to Trump's case, that extends back to the mercantilist and nation dynamics, and as opposed to the economic dynamics. You talked about, for example, NATO. And it strikes me that the economic dynamics have changed a great deal since Marx wrote. In particular, the rise of international corporations, as opposed to national. Now we think in terms of national boundaries. And I see you nodding your head, so I'll let you answer that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And so maybe we can also get the citizen of the planet one to ask his question. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Anthony, when you said we are tired of fighting to the end with Russia, for a moment I thought maybe the EU had finally decided to discontinue its war with Russia, which I consider the West, at least previously US-led Western world against Russia, to already be World War III. It just hasn't turned nuclear yet. And it sort of reminded me, the Clausewitz statement, war is a continuation of politics by other means. This NATO war against Russia sort of reminds me, makes me think of war as the extension of the economy by other means. So my question for you is, regular listeners here know that I've been taking a poll of various scholars about whether we are going to war against China and whether the US military is going to construct a ring of steel around China. I find it interesting that Trump said that the EU is the real enemy. And he said that the reason the EU was formed was to rip off the United States, and said the EU was worse than China. So I'm wondering what you have to say about that. And when you said, "Are we going to have World War III?" What you were thinking about Europe and Russia, or the U.S. and China? Thank you.
Go ahead, Tony.
Gene's remarks, very interesting stuff. He cites the civilization ideology. That is a very big thing, and I didn't say a word about that. So thanks to Gene for bringing that up, that the Chinese think of it as the rise of a Chinese civilization. And you got to say also that the Russians think of it as the rise of a Russian civilization. And they even have a term civilization state that they start to use now. People like Alexander Dugin, for example, has a lot of influence in Russia, likes to put everything in terms of a Russian dream, Russian idea. It's those of you who have ever read any Nikolai Berdyaev will recognize some of these ideas from the 20s and the 30s about a Russian civilization and a Russian way and all of the rest of that. Civilizational ideology. I am not very supportive of this notion of civilizational ideology, and somehow I feel that it will not really have legs, historically speaking. I think in the end, it is an argument to say that your foreign policy represents something more than national interest. Something more than national. It's an ideological way of presenting foreign policy. And I have a feeling that people will never accept it in quite that way. But I could be, of course, I could be entirely wrong. Nevertheless, if I had to vote for Alexander Dugin for anything, I would not vote for him. I would probably vote for whoever ran against him. And moreover, I would put it maybe even more strongly that I think the civilizational ideology is kind of a dangerous and bad idea in the present and going forward. The signification of Marxism, about which the Chinese speak, I don't think this is a healthy tendency in China. I think the more the Chinese become, how to put it, civilizationally minded, the worse things will be for the Chinese people and the Chinese economy. I think the Chinese have to think of themselves as a state in terms of, and the Russians too, have to think of themselves as states that are living in history, and a history which is the history of the revolutionary waves from the 18th century, the English Revolution, the Dutch Revolution, the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. Have to think about those as waves, have to think about Western civilization as part of those waves, and have to become part of that current in order to be genuinely progressive. And I think to talk about civilizations and their eternal, how to put it, their eternal spirit and their eternal value and blah, 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 this sounds retrograde to me. Okay, so you can say this is the idea of a Westerner and a defender of Western civilization, and you might be right. Okay, then Richard talks about economic nationalism, but the whole thing was about economic nationalism, and we will continue to discuss what of course that means. And he also talks, I believe, the other listener whose name I did not catch, talks about war with Russia and how we are in World War III already. Good point. It could be that this is that we are living in a period vis-a-vis World War III that we lived in between 1939 and 1941, when we did not have a world war yet. What we had was a European war. And we had a number of squabbles going on all over the world, warlike events, of course, but the World War did not become truly a world war until the Soviet Union and the United States came into it. Then it became a world war. We might be in a period like that right now. The how to put it, the threshold, the footsteps, or the steps toward World War III. So this is a very sharp remark by, I'm sorry, I did not pick up the name.
Citizen of the planet.
Okay, referenced Clausewitz and NATO versus Russia, and the EU. Is the EU ripping off the United States? You could make the argument that the EU was set up in such a way that it actually offended certain industrial interests in the United States. We allowed them to put up a big tariff, and we wanted to sell all our goods, especially our automobiles. We wanted to sell them in Europe, and in the end, the Europeans get to sell them in the United States. That looks like a big ripoff. It's possible to look at things in that way. And a number of economists have come forward to say that, this is fundamentally wrong way of looking at things, blah, 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 blah. This is economic reasoning. The point of it is politics, not economics. All that was done, the EU was encouraged, and all of that was done as a weapon in the Cold War against Russia. Had there been no Cold War against Russia, I don't think the United States ever would have engaged in those things.
And war with China, that question, U.S. war with China?
So what was the question again about war with China?
Whether you think that there's a coming U.S. war with China.
It's coming?
Whether you think so. Do you think there is a coming U.S. war with China, as many people have said?
Yeah. I would answer the way Norman Angell answered in the Great Illusion, part of World War I. It's impossible because it's so irrational. It's so irrational. Therefore, it's impossible. But he turned out to be wrong about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So now we go to Norma. Please go ahead, Norma.
Right. Thanks for your presentation, Anthony. And hello, everybody. Let's see. I say Xi Jinping, like Pope Leo, the new Pope, is on a missionary evangelistic path. Xi Jinping grew up communist. That's different from growing up capitalist. It sets your mind in another way. I say he's looking to let people express their basic behavior, which is to create an environment, a world in which we help each other, and that all the efforts that we here in the West have been working on, all the change that we here, not the Trumpists, have been working on, is communist care, whether they call it communist or not, but it's about us caring for each other. This is saying that Xi launched a trade war that would shake the, let's see, I posted this in the chat because I want to get the article out of the New York Times, and I can't. He chose the aggressive course of utilizing capitalism to maintain the communist structure that they were only able to maintain through using capitalist tactics, but that it was all directed at furthering the communist development, the mindset, the different mind that the people of China grew up with, were indoctrinated with from the cradle, which is the opposite of being indoctrinated with capitalism. You can see my comment in the chat if you feel like taking the time. I'm going to write a letter back to the New York Times if I ever get the article and tell them what I just told you. Communism is you can't call it a religion, but it's a commitment to the justice that Jean was talking about, for one, I think.
2 minutes.
I don't have to repeat it.
Okay, thank you. Any comment, Tony?
Let's see. Norma says she is like a missionary. I think so too. And she doesn't know what he thinks yet. the opportunities presented to China right now are on a scale that has not been seen in centuries. In fact, Xi said something just like that to Putin. He said, "Do you realize the changes that we're seeing haven't been seen in 100 years?" And certainly true. Certainly true. They don't know what opportunities they have. They don't know what they want in the final analysis. But they are going to have enormous opportunities and enormous chances in the world. Some things are going to get forced on them, the Chinese leaders, and they'll have to actually, intervene in world politics, maybe even in a more serious way than they have. But already they've set up the institutions for a rival order. And I mean, an alternative to the dollar. And they're seriously trying to put the dollar out of business as we speak. No doubt they have accumulated gold on an enormous scale in preparation for the time when they will introduce a currency alternative to the dollar. The chances in the world are enormous for them, and they don't know what they want yet because so many possibilities are opening up. So when she says that they're like missionaries, that's a kind of a good way to put it. In my opinion, very sharp way to put it.
They're different from us, is what I'm saying. They're totally different from us.
That's
They're
another
using
point.
they're using our tactics, but they come from the opposite spectrum.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have Sharon Rose now. Could you please unmute yourself? Go ahead, Sharon.
Thank you very much, Tony. I have just a couple of comments that I wanted to see what you think about. So first of all, last week we touched on the whole question of predicting war. And I think Citizen raised a good point last week that it doesn't help for when we're talking about trying to change the way people think about political struggle to keep on saying, oh, there's going to be a war against Iran next week. The Israelis are going to bomb Iran next week, or for sure there's going to be a war with China. We as Marxists have a methodology in which we can talk about the dangers of war, the tendency toward war, and the wrong policies of our own bourgeoisie, which will lead to war. That's a much better framework for talking about it, which I think you do. I'm not saying that you're trying to predict exactly when a war is going to start, but just in general, I think it's important to make that distinction. On some historical questions that you touched on. So in my opinion, the US being in a pre-war situation historically it was not 6 years from it was not the 3 years between 39 and 41, or it was that pre-war for us started in 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria and took over China, and subsequently. People tend to forget about that. I think that the World War II was 14 years altogether, from 1931 to 1945. And finally, on the demise of the Soviet Union, I think that we should not drop out the fact that of the 50 million people who died in the Second World War, 30 million were Soviets, roughly, Soviet citizens. And what the Soviet Union lost was its best cadre, its very best cadre. And I don't think they ever recovered from that. I see the demise of the Soviet Union as the final victory of the Nazis over the Soviet Union. Or you could say the West over the Soviet Union.
2 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think Judith has not spoken yet. So go ahead, Judith. Unmute yourself and please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. So I haven't really thought this out yet, but it seems to me that the great changes that are taking place are mainly due to the fact that that the East, Southeast Asia, and the rest of Asia is now being developed. That it is more than cheap labor. It's a market, and it's also a place where industry, where that is industrializing, and Africa also, which is trailing it by a considerable amount, is also developing. And I think that this is the source of China's power, and it's the source of the demise of the American imperium, because they have retained their exploitative method of doing business, rather than getting on the bandwagon. So, and I see that other countries are now trying to imitate the Chinese Belt and Road. The Arab countries and India, they're all trying to construct land routes from Asia to Europe. So please tell me what you think of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. So let's see. I'm going to call on myself as well. Tony, you mentioned Kautsky's, thinking about a global term, and that he was maybe ahead of his time. So if we were to look at the world today, what we are seeing is that, yes, with Trump, there is a tendency towards nationalism in economics, but on the other hand, it looks like everywhere, including China, my view, is that everywhere the capitalism is reigning, and so it has spread all over the world. Only when about 50 years ago, 1/3 of the world was socialist. Today we don't see that. So if I was a globalist, I would say, hey, look, we won. So there is no need for trying to control the world in the way that imperialism has done up to now. And so we can pull back, let the countries themselves, all capitalists, work it among themselves. And maybe there are a few wars here and there, but that's okay. It's not impeding the development of imperialism or development of capitalism around. They can think about this, but we still have the basic contradictions of capitalism, whether it's in Chinese format or whether it's in Canadian format. So this is going to, at one point, come to fore, and will limit what we are seeing as the Chinese model. So what I think trying to say is that maybe what we are seeing as a pullback to nationalism, economic nationalism, is a success of imperialism, saying that there is nobody against us anymore. So I'd like to see what you think about this. Thank
you. So should I respond? Okay.
Yes, please.
Let's see. Sharon said that we engage in predictions of war, and she was wondering about what we can predict. And certainly, it looks like we're on the path at this moment. I'm trying to finish up a book it's a history of globalism. And I'm on the very last chapter, and I'm trying to take it up to the present. And I am kind of stumped as to how to conclude the whole thing. And the very last thing I have to talk about is this the path to war? In other words, is this book really the origins of World War III? The same way you would write the origins of World War I from 1870. And when I was a grad student, I had to read a lot of books that said World War I, you couldn't understand World War I unless you started in 1870. The rise of German power, blah, 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 blah. And all the rest of that. So it's entirely possible that the demise of globalism is the origins of World War III. And it might actually be going on right now, as somebody has already suggested. Okay, yeah, that's true. And the last thing we should talk about is to say that we ought to oppose this. We ought to urge that our leaders do everything that they can to oppose it. And if we are intellectuals, we ought to write articles. We ought to make speeches, and the rest of that, in order that this thing might be prevented. And so far, I would say most of these speeches, these writings, all the rest of it, warning about the danger of war, have not got anywhere. And I think we still are on this war path. But there is one other countervailing force that might keep us from war, and that is war itself. It may be that the wars are just impossible, even for people, fascist-minded people, who believe in war. Maybe impossible for them to pull off for fear of defeat. So you might say that about Ukraine today. You might say that about Russia. You might say that about Israel today. And you might even say that about Israel's opponents in the Middle East. That it may be that we reach a point where it is simply impossible to conduct war anymore. War will have spoken, historically speaking, will have spoken against war. So I think that's a possibility. And then the second thing that Sharon brought out that I thought was very interesting, she's talking about the pre-war. And she sees the thing as a struggle against fascism, and largely, I think, in terms of the perspectives of World War II, which I grew up with. So I was a small child during World War II, and I got to say that I was subjected to just about every kind of war propaganda that you can possibly think of. Daffy Duck cartoons, everything was war. When I was a child, and I really breathed the air of this war business. And they really wanted to indoctrinate us and say us that we were fighting this danger, or should have been fighting this danger from long since. Way back in 1931, they said, when the Japanese invaded Manchuria, we should have risen up on our hind legs and opposed the Japanese. Well, wait a minute. That you can't imagine the United States fighting Japan over Manchuria in 1931. Come on. That's not right for the period. It's impossible. Would have been impossible for any kind of mobilization against Japan. Just the opposite. Winston Churchill, of all people, who eventually became the champion of the struggle against fascism, back in 1931, he applauded the Japanese seizure of Manchuria. He saw that as an anti-Soviet act and thought it was just terrific. So the attitude that was taken by British ruling orders in those days is very pro-Japanese. The United States had to break through that. Serious antagonism between the United States and Japan over the Far East. And the British trying to come to terms, even in 1941, they signed a pact with the Japanese to try to preserve their relations. So I think it's impossible to look at it in terms of this long rise of the threat that finally was confronted in World War II. And then secondly, I think I would stick to the notion of 1931 to 1941 as a, antechamber for World War II rather than World War II itself, which only became truly World War when the Soviets and the Americans came into it. Okay, that's That's what those are very interesting questions raised by Sharon. And then Judith says, this is all a matter of the rise of the East. And she's breathing the same air as the editors of the Financial Times and the Economist who've been talking about Easternization for several years now. Gideon Rachman, maybe the most influential voice, wrote actually a book called Easternization. So everybody thinks this is the case. And the Belt and Road, that's part of the argument. You know, the Chinese are dynamic in terms of infrastructure. They get things done. Could that be because they're socialist? But at any rate, they get things done. And instead of waiting for someone to invest in something or other, the way they do in the West, the state does it. And if the state feels like it, it can build just about anything. And nowadays, the Chinese have this infrastructure capacity that has not been known to humanity, and can build bridges and railroads and God knows what, can build anything, anywhere. And it is the wonder of the world, and nothing that the world can put together, in my opinion, can match it if it's just a question of matching it. The only thing you can do is oppose it militarily in some way, where that is being done. Lastly, though, I would say that the big changes the Chinese claim to be part of are often argued by somebody like, say, Vijay Prashad. Often argued as the Bandung movement. It's the third world. It's the revolt against the West, finally succeeding. It almost succeeded in the 1970s with OPEC and the oil shocks, but that didn't quite work out. Now it is really coming to the fore. I think this is very sharp, and of course I can't deny that they've got a lot of points to make on behalf of that argument. But I think one also has to say that the third world is not going to be united in the future, and we're going to get God knows what in terms of great power assertion. For example, the Turks. Nobody knows what kind of factor the Turks will be in world affairs from this point on. And there are other cases, many, in fact, several cases, many cases. Nobody knows what kind of factor a fully nationalist regime, which imagines itself able to have an aggressive forward foreign policy, what that can produce in the world. There will not be this unity of all the Bandung powers, all the former victims of imperialism against Western imperialism. No, that will not happen. All right, and then Mehmet says, with reference to Kautsky and globalism, that capitalism was rising at the time, and I think he's saying, I don't know, he can clarify this, but I think he's saying that Kautsky had a point.
Yes.
Okay, and that Lenin's argument, against Kautsky was not really an economic argument. He didn't say the economy is going to cause the imperialists to break up. He just said Kautsky was wrong because the imperialists will always be fighting each other. He turned out, I think, to be more or less correct about that against Kautsky. But it's not an economic argument, I don't think. Lenin would say it has to do with the rise of imperialism as a phase of capital. But in Lenin's essay on imperialism in 1916, he keeps referencing the banks. Yes, the banks rose up. Finance capital rose up when imperialism rose up at the end of the century. But where's the exact connection? Places where finance capital did not rise up so rigorously, they were still imperialist. So I think the argument is an old-fashioned Clausewitzian, Machiavellian, you could even say, argument about states and the balance of power and national interests and antagonisms of imperialism and all that, that Lenin is arguing there. And I could see where Kautsky would say, it's not even Marxist, not even Marxist. Okay, so let's see. Oh, lastly, Mehmed says there might be more contradictions and more expansions and more dynamism in the world economy from now on. I think he said that. And I think that's right, if I've got that right, that there's more room for big changes in the world right now than there has been. I think that's correct. And another way of putting that, you could say, a historian would put it this way. He'd say, the world is more revolutionary now than it's ever been. I think that's right. I think that's right. I think Xi Jinping, whatever you think of him, I think he grasps that the world is much more open and revolutionary, meaning that it's not possible to put down every outrage, such as the rise of Burkina Faso revolutionary Bonapartism against the French. It's not possible to put that down. So we're going to see all kinds of wild things happening from this point on.
Yeah, thank you for those. Now we are going to, I don't think we have anybody who has not spoken, so I'm gonna let Raj go ahead, and then Citizen of the Planet. This is the second round.
Thank you. Actually, I want to enter this argument between
Would
you
you
and...
speak closer to your microphone? It's hard to hear you.
I want to get into this argument between you and Mehmet about Kautsky and Lenin, and I want to approach it from this angle about why we see greater tension between countries today. And I think Citizen of the Planet, it says that we may have entered the Third World War. And I think, and you acknowledge that. So basically the way I see it, Lenin got his analysis out of Marx, which says capital needs markets and both labor and materials, and it has to expand beyond the national border. And so then that's what we saw happening in Lenin's time. And then because capitalists form under a nation state, they group themselves kind of like mafia within the nation state. The state is the mafiosi for the capitalist class, and then they fight each other because capitalists don't reach an agreement because the profit is, accumulation and profit rate are two big things. And I think, and then Marx says that there is a tendency for the profit rate to fall because of increase in organic composition of capital, which is continuously happening. And I think G7 has the highest of that. And because China's success in capturing the global market, thanks to their help from Americans to begin with, now we are back to what Lenin had predicted for World War II. Basically, World War II was anticipated by Lenin. And I think we're, for a similar reason, the wars are not about because states have some inherent interest for their country. It is about capitalism. And that's why I think this thesis of civilizational state like China or India or Russia, which is Dugin's thesis, I've read it very carefully. I don't subscribe to it. Anyway, you can go ahead, comment anyway. I think Kautsky was wrong. I agree with you. Kautsky thought you could unite, but ultimately the bandits don't unite. They fight each other. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Citizen?
Okay, I want to emphasize what I put in the chat. When I said that the West is already in World War III with Russia, I want to emphasize that it's World War III by proxy, where Ukraine is meant to be the sacrificial lamb, not any Western country. So I don't believe that any superpowers will be going to war with each other. I really appreciate, before my question, I really appreciated what Sharon Rose said this week and also last week. And I would add more of my own thoughts to that. When ordinary people keep hearing about the so-called imminent collapse of capitalism or the imminent collapse of U.S. empire or imminent war with North Korea or Iran and China, and it doesn't ever happen. This has been going on. These imminent predictions have been going on for decades. Then ordinary people just stop listening to leftists and just start tuning the leftists out. These so-called imminent predictions are even without any logical analysis. like the Iraq War was a war for oil, which it wasn't, I assert. It was a war for Israel. And unfortunately, people like Chomsky continue what I call these leftist trutheisms. Chomsky certainly doesn't want anyone to understand that Iraq was a war for Israel. A couple more comments before my question. When you said that war with China is just so irrational, it's impossible. And I totally agree with that. I pointed out that China is an international thermonuclear ballistic missile superpower with 1.4 billion people. Furthermore, the US could not even afford to economically go to war with an advanced military power, whether it's North Korea, Iran, or China. So my question is, Anthony, you seem to be, maybe my perception's wrong, you seem to be backtracking on this a little. You said that you quoted that war with China is so irrational that it's impossible. But then you say that certainly we're on the path to war. I cannot see any superpowers going to war with each other, at least military superpowers, if not economic superpowers, like I mentioned. So I'm wondering if you're backtracking. And excuse me, everyone, since it's second round, Anthony, what do you think of the Trump-Saudi deal? We know he's only doing it for himself, but where does that come in? Thank you.
Should I answer?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's see. I've kind of lost track of, Raj. Raj talks about the Kautsky-Lenin. Mehmet and I are talking about Kautsky and Lenin. There's an interesting discussion in view of the economic arguments about globalism. But I would maintain, I would think if you look very closely at that discussion between Lenin and Kautsky, I would maintain that Lenin's is the position of the continuity of national quarrels, national antagonisms through this whole period. I think that is the essence of the Lenin position. You may say that's not even Marxist. I'm pretty sure most of the Marxists of his generation would have said that wasn't a Marxist argument. We need some economics in here, blah, 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 blah. But Lenin, I think, in the final analysis is saying the imperialists have these antagonisms. And there we are. And by the way, when you go back and look at Marx, I think Marx has a tendency to say that too. He's not going to get into all of the detail, all of the weeds, discussing how it is that nations fight wars. But just to recognize that it does happen, that you do have these conflicts of ambitions. It has to do with the way the world is organized territorially. Okay, I don't want to get into some kind of metaphysical thing where I start talking about the lust for power and all sorts of nonsense like that. I don't want to get into that, but I do need to say that it exists. I do need to say it exists. And I think Lenin's argument is cognizant. And in fact, the essence of Lenin's argument against Kautsky is a political argument. It's not an economic argument. And it says there's going to be imperial antagonisms. They're not going to be able to get along. Okay? So that lesson seemed to be driven home by World War II. You couldn't get any sharper. You couldn't get any sharper example of imperialist antagonisms than Germany, Italy, and Japan, these rising dynamic powers, duking it out with the other great powers. I mean, imperial antagonisms, those are key. And Stalin was so impressed by that in 1946, he gave a speech in which he said, the imperialists will never get together against us. The imperial antagonisms, on the basis of Leninism, on the basis of the experience of the last generation, the imperialists will never combine against us. They will always fight against each other and have wars against each other. Wrong. The Cold War resulted after that. So there we are. Nevertheless, I would still say that there's a continuity of national antagonisms that has to be appreciated in all of this. And when we talk about economic nationalism, it's not an economic argument, it's a political argument. So that was my original thesis in the talk today. Lastly, a question about a war with China and how irrational, it certainly is irrational, and we react the way Norman Angell and Kautsky reacted to World War I. It's absolutely, it's irrational, therefore it can't happen. And I said this about China, didn't I? But you know, right now they're planning and trying to figure out ways for it to happen. There is a strategic literature on limited war, which has a certain history through the Cold War, limited nuclear war. And it can happen because the main confrontation does not have to be on land. It can be in the Pacific Ocean. It can be conducted by submarines as well as surface vessels. There can be quarrels over little islands, which are decided by the use of nuclear weapons. You see the Indians and the Pakistanis now fooling around with a war. They are both nuclear powers, and they are both at the edge of a nuclear war, and they're not doing it. That is encouragement to the rest of the world that it may be possible to go a little bit further and use nuclear weapons in a small way and have some kind of a limited nuclear conflict at sea in the future.
But India and Pakistan also backed off of their war.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, they were not about to go to nuclear war. Many people don't know that the kindly Jimmy Carter sort of semi-planned a limited nuclear war between South Korea and North Korea. And that's why he had hundreds, if not thousands, of tactical nuclear weapons based in South Korea. And they decided, no, there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. So I just wanted to add that. And you know, China wouldn't be sending the U.S. panda bears if relations were all that hostile. No panda bears to the U.S. Thank you.
I consider that friendly.
Yeah. So if that's it, we are right at time, 12:30, where we end the program. Sorry for others who have the hands up, but we are out of time. I want to thank Tony for sparing this time for us, and a very informative and very great discussion and information that he presented for us. I'm sure we are going to continue this next week and the others as well, using this as the base for the information we're going to use. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for participating. Hope to see you next week. We're going to have the discussion, continuation of this next week. And Tony, again, thank you so much. And good luck with the ending of your new book. We are waiting for that, by the way. Just publish it as quickly as you can. We're going to get our hands on it. Thank you again, everybody.
That sounds like some sales.
Yeah.
It is.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.